The car rumbled to a stop, its tires screeching as they met the cracked, overgrown pavement. A veil of mist hung low over the nearly forgotten town, blurring the outlines of decrepit buildings and casting an eerie glow under the dim, cloud-covered sky. Ahead of them stood the Ravenwood Inn, its towering silhouette framed against the backdrop of twisted, leafless trees. The faded sign above the entrance swayed in the breeze, the words barely legible beneath decades of grime and decay. "This can't be the place," Ethan muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His usually confident voice wavered as his gaze lingered on the darkened windows, each one resembling a lifeless eye staring back at them. "It's definitely the place," James replied, his forced smile failing to mask his own unease. He turned off the engine, the sudden silence inside the car amplifying the distant rustle of leaves and the faint creak of the inside. The group of 5 friends sat in tense silence, the oppressive atmosphere of the inn seemingly creeping into the car. Lena, always the one to break the tension, gave a half-hearted laugh. "Come on, guys, it's just an old building. This is supposed to be fun, remember? Weekend getaway?" No one responded. Even Sarah, the quietest of the group, seemed more withdrawn than usual. Her wide eyes were fixed on the inn's entrance, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She couldn't explain it, but the building felt wrong. Not just old or abandoned, something deeper, something darker. "I had a weird dream last night," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It looked just like this place, but there was something waiting inside." "All right, let's just get this over with," Alex said, his voice edged with irritation as he opened the car door. The others followed reluctantly, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. The air was colder than it should have been for late autumn, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made Sarah's stomach turn. As they approached the inn, its towering structure seemed to lean forward, casting them in its shadow. The front door groaned open before anyone could touch it, the sound echoing like a warning. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but James shrugged and stepped inside first. The lobby was steeped in darkness, illuminated only by the weak flicker of a single bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. Shadows danced along the peeling wallpaper in faded portraits that lined the walls. A heavy, musty scent filled the air, layered with something sharper, like rusted metal and damp earth. One of the portraits caught Sarah's eye, a stern-looking man with piercing eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved. "Hello?" James called out, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. It echoed unnaturally, as if the building itself were holding its breath. After a long moment, a door creaked open at the far end of the room. From the shadows emerged an elderly man, his hunched figure illuminated briefly by the flickering light. His face was gaunt, his hollow eyes sunken deep into their sockets. When he spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, like the groan of ancient wood. "Room 312, he rasped, sliding a tarnished key across the desk. His hand lingered on it for a moment, his gaze locking onto Sarah's. "But be warned," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some doors are better left unopened." The group froze, his words settling over them like a shroud. Before they could respond, the man disappeared into the shadows as suddenly as he had appeared. The only sound was the faint hum of the flickering bulb. "Great," Ethan muttered, picking up the key with trembling fingers. "This is definitely how a horror movie starts." As they climbed the creaking staircase, the air seemed to grow heavier with each step. The 3rd floor was dimly lit, the corridor stretching out like a tunnel into darkness. Room 312 stood at the very end, its door slightly ajar. A faint draft seeped out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. The wallpaper here was different, darker, with strange patterns that almost seemed to shift when no one was looking. "Maybe we should," Sarah began, but her voice trailed off as Lena pushed the door open, her usual bravado faltering for just a moment. The room beyond was cloaked in shadow, the furnishings faded and covered in a thin layer of dust. A shattered mirror hung crookedly on the wall, reflecting fragmented images of the group. Then, it came, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable. A whisper, drifting through the still air. "Get out." Sarah's breath hitched, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the others could hear it. Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded slowly, his face pale. "It came from the mirror," he whispered, stepping back instinctively. The whisper came again, louder this time, and more insistent. "Get out." The air in the room grew icy, and the faint draft became a sudden, chilling gust that extinguished the dim light spilling in from the hallway. "Let's go," Alex said firmly, grabbing Lena's arm, but as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. leaving them trapped in darkness. The friends settled into their room, room 312, after a long day of travel and a strange first impression of the hotel. Despite their unease, they did their best to brush it off as fatigue and the dark, creaky old building playing tricks on their minds. But deep down, something felt wrong, something was off about this place. The first sign came just after they had all unpacked their bags. As they settled in, chatting about their plans for the weekend, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. James, always the skeptic, immediately assumed the chill was simply the effect of an old, unheated building. "It's just the air conditioning," he muttered, tugging at his jacket. But no one else was convinced. The air was heavy, like it was filled with something other than mere coldness, a presence, a weight, pressing down on them. Ethan was the first to notice something more. He was sitting near the window, staring out at the overgrown yard below, when he heard a faint sound, a whisper, so quiet it could have been the wind. But the words were clear, and they chilled him to the bone. "Leave, before it's too late." He turned quickly, scanning the room. The others were busy, rummaging through their bags or lounging on the bed, seemingly oblivious to the sound. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. "Maybe I'm just tired," he thought. But it wasn't just Ethan. As the night wore on, more odd things began happening. Sarah, usually the quiet one, began to feel something was watching her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was behind her, even when she was alone in the bathroom. When she'd step out, it was like the room would go silent, too silent, as if everyone had stopped moving for a split second. Holding their breath, she'd glance around quickly, her heart racing, but no one would be there. Just the lingering stillness, as if the very air around her was watching, waiting. Lena tried to distract herself by exploring the hotel, but the eerie silence in the hallways disturbed her. Each step echoed loudly as if the floors were alive, groaning underfoot. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and the dim lights flickered as though they were on the verge of dying out. As she wandered, she noticed strange marks on the walls, smudged handprints that were too high to be from children and too old to have been made recently. Her breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to continue, attributing it to the age of the hotel. Meanwhile, Alex and James were trying to get the TV to work, but it refused to show anything other than static. It was as though the very electronics in the room were malfunctioning. James cursed under his breath and turned to Alex. "You're sure we're in the right room? I mean, that guy downstairs, he seemed a little off, don't you think?" Alex shrugged. "Old man, old hotel, old problems, it's probably nothing." But as he spoke, a loud bang came from the hallway, startling both of them. The two jumped up and rushed to the door, peering into the dim corridor. It was empty, just a flickering light at the far end of the hallway and the oppressive silence. Neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, listening. There was nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams that supported the building. But the air felt charged, as if something was about to break the silence. The whispers grew more frequent as the night wore on, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the corners of the room, from behind the curtains, from under the bed. Every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. Ethan, unable to take it any longer, decided to confront whatever was happening. He stood up from his chair and marched to the window, peering out into the darkness. The yard below was empty, but the air felt thicker now. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was suffocating. He stood there for a few moments, breathing in the stale air, trying to gather his thoughts. But then, without warning, he heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Get out, or you will never leave." Ethan spun around, heart pounding. The room was still, too still. The others were still talking, oblivious to the increasing tension in the air. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat felt tight. There was no explanation, no rational answer, only the chilling certainty that something in this room knew they were here and it wasn't happy about it. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, rattling the old window panes. The lights flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch across the room like fingers reaching for them. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The friends all jumped, staring at the door as if it might open on its own. But it didn't. James was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here. Something's not right." The group was now visibly shaken, their earlier bravado replaced by a mounting sense of dread. But just as they moved toward the door, another noise, this time from the corner of the room, beneath the bed, caught their attention. It was soft at first, like a muffled scrape, followed by the unmistakable sound of something or someone breathing. The air seemed to grow even colder, and Ethan, now visibly trembling, grabbed Lena's arm. "Did you hear that? I swear, there's something under the bed." Lena stepped back, her eyes wide. "We need to get out now," she said, panic creeping into her voice. But before anyone could reach the door, the lights flickered once more, and for a moment, the room seemed to change. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air was thick with an almost tangible presence. The whispers were louder now, almost like a chant. "Leave now. Leave before it's too late. You are not welcome here." In that moment, the friends realized the true horror of what they were facing. They weren't alone. The room itself was alive with something dark, something ancient, something that fed on fear. They moved toward the door again, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was as if the room had trapped them. The walls seemed to close in, and the very air grew thick with suffocating tension. Panic set in as they realized the true nature of the hotel they had entered. They were no longer guests, they were prisoners. And room 312? It was alive, its malevolent presence seeping into their very souls, whispering, watching, waiting for them to make their next move. The group had spent a restless night in room 312, haunted by strange occurrences and growing fears of an unseen force that seemed to have claimed the space as its own. Each whisper, each flicker of the lights, only deepened their unease. By morning, the friends were exhausted, their nerves frayed, but they were also more determined to understand what had been happening. What had they walked into? What was behind the eerie happenings of that night? The unsettling whispers, the cold air, the feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something far more sinister than an old, forgotten hotel. As the group sat huddled around the small, rickety table in the corner of the room, each of them trying to come to grips with what they had experienced, they knew they needed answers. James, ever the skeptic, was the first to suggest they leave. "This place is haunted, guys. It's not a joke anymore," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We need to get out of here." But Lena, who had spent the night in a sleepless state, stared at him, her expression hardening. "If we leave now, we may never know what's really going on. This hotel, this room, there's something here, something dark." Alex nodded, looking out the window at the murky sky. But what? What could be causing all this? It was Sarah who spoke next. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the fan. "Maybe it's time we find out. Maybe it's time we look into the history of this place." The others turned to her, surprise etched across their faces. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. Sarah stood, her feet moving almost mechanically toward the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. She had noticed the dusty, old books when they first entered but hadn't paid them much attention. Now, something was pulling her toward them. She ran her fingers over the worn spines, their titles faded with age. One book in particular caught her eye, its cover tattered and stained. "The History of Ravenwood Inn," the title read in gold letters, barely legible. She pulled it from the shelf and opened it to a random page. As she scanned the contents, her face went pale. "This hotel, it's not what we think it is. It wasn't always like this." James walked over to her, a skeptical look on his face. "What do you mean? It's just a rundown hotel, right?" Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a deep sense of fear in them. "No, it's not. According to this book, Ravenwood Inn has a dark past, a past filled with death, tragedy, and murder." The others gathered around her as she read aloud, her voice growing quieter as she went on. "The hotel was once a thriving, luxury destination. It attracted visitors from all over, wealthy travelers and those seeking refuge from the world. But something happened here. In the early 1900s, a string of mysterious deaths began to plague the guests who stayed in room 312. It started with a young couple, honeymooners. They checked in and were never seen again. The room was found empty, but the bed was drenched in blood. No one knew what happened to them, and the police could never find any evidence of foul play." Sarah paused, her breath catching in her throat. And it didn't stop there. Over the next several decades, dozens of guests who stayed in room 312 vanished, leaving behind nothing but traces of blood and strange, unexplained marks on the walls. Many believed the room to be cursed, but no one dared to speak of it, for fear of attracting the wrath of whatever was lurking inside. Lena felt a chill creep down her spine as she listened. "So, what happened to the hotel? Why is it still open?" Sarah turned the page slowly, her hand trembling as she continued to read. "After the last known disappearance, the hotel was closed for years. It remained abandoned. the rumors surrounding it growing with each passing decade. It was only recently, in the last 5 years, that the hotel was reopened under new ownership. The building had fallen into disrepair, but despite its condition, it drew a small crowd of curious visitors, people who wanted to experience the haunting or simply take a look at a piece of history. James stepped back, running his hands through his hair. So, you're telling me this place has been haunted for over a century, and we're just sitting in the middle of it? Sarah nodded, looking at the book with an expression of disbelief. That's exactly what I'm saying. The room grew quiet as the reality of the situation settled in. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of the growing horror. They were not in a normal hotel. They were in a place that had been stained by death, by something dark and malicious, something that had been waiting for them. As they continued to discuss what to do next, Lena felt the unmistakable presence of something else in the room. It was the same feeling she had had when she first stepped inside, like something was watching them. The air was heavy again, almost suffocating. The whispers from last night seemed to echo in her mind, their words lingering in the silence. She turned to the others. We need to find out more. We need to know what happened to those people. What's still here? Ethan, who had been pacing nervously, stopped in his tracks. What do you mean? What's still here? Lena looked at him, her face pale. We know now that this room is cursed, but we don't know why. We need to go down to the front desk. We need to ask the owner or whoever's running this place. They must know something. The others hesitated, but Lena's determination was hard to ignore. They had to face whatever was going on, or they would never be free of it. They gathered their things and made their way down the creaking staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the hotel. When they reached the front desk, they found the elderly man there again, sitting behind the counter, as if he had never left. His eyes seemed to follow them with an unsettling intensity. Can I help you? He asked, his voice quiet and gravelly. We need to know more about this place, James said, his voice sharp with urgency. About room 312. What's really going on here? The old man didn't flinch. He simply stared at them, his eyes narrowing as though weighing their intentions. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then, finally, the man spoke. You should not be asking about room 312, he said softly. Some things are better left in the past. His words were laced with an eerie finality, as if he knew more than he was letting on. But the group wasn't ready to let it go. They pressed him for more, their desperation growing. The old man sighed deeply, his weathered face softening with what seemed like regret. Very well, he murmured, but you may not like what you hear. And with that, he began to tell them the true history of the Ravenwood, in a history soaked in blood and tragedy, a history they had only begun to uncover. The old man's words hung in the air like a thick fog, his warning echoing in their minds as they made their way back up to room 312. There was something in his tone, an unsettling mixture of regret and dread, that only deepened the terror the group was already feeling. They had learned about the dark history of the hotel, about the unspeakable horrors tied to room 312. But the question remained, why did this room hold such a power over people? Why did it seem to draw them in, trapping them in its grip? As they stood outside the door to room 312, Lena felt her heart race. The hallway felt colder than it had the previous night, and the flickering lights seemed more erratic, as though they too were on the brink of losing control. The wood beneath their feet creaked louder than ever before, and the air was thick with an oppressive weight. It was as if the room itself had come alive, its presence stretching beyond the walls and reaching into every corner of the hotel. James, his face pale and drawn, reached out to open the door, but something made him pause. Do you feel that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others froze, each of them instinctively glancing around, their breath shallow in the cold air. It was then that Sarah noticed it, the faintest distortion in the air, just in front of the door. It shimmered, almost imperceptible, like heat rising off pavement on a hot day. The air itself seemed to ripple, a visual manifestation of the malevolent force that had been lurking in the room since they arrived. No, Lena replied, her voice trembling, but I can feel it. It's like something's trying to keep us out. They stood there for a long moment, the silence heavy and suffocating. Then, with a shared glance, they all stepped into the room. The room, now shrouded in the dim light of the early evening, felt different. The air was colder, thicker, and the oppressive silence from earlier had been replaced by an almost tangible hum. The room was alive, as though it had been waiting for them. The walls, once cracked and peeling, now seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The floorboards creaked underfoot, but this time, the sound wasn't coming from their movements. It was as if the room itself was shifting, adjusting, responding to their presence. Ethan, who had been unusually quiet up until this point, spoke up, his voice unsteady. This isn't right. It's like the room is reacting to us. But it was too late. With a sudden, violent motion, Lena ripped the chest open. It's worse than that, Lena murmured, her eyes darting around the room. It's like the room has a mind of its own. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder than it ever had before, its hands moving in an erratic fashion. Each tick seemed to echo through their skulls, growing in intensity until it became a constant thrum in the back of their minds. James' hand clenched into a fist at his side, his muscles tense with fear. And then, the whispers began again. They were faint at first, no louder than the wind rustling through the trees, but they grew steadily, like a wave swelling before crashing onto the shore. The sound was not coming from any direction. It surrounded them, as though it were emanating from the very walls themselves. No one could understand what was being said, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, desperate, tortured. Alex clutched at his ears. "It's in my head! It's in my head!" he screamed. Lena ran over to him, her own panic rising. "We have to stay calm. It's not real, it's just the room, trying to mess with us." But deep down, they all knew the truth. This was no ordinary hotel room. It was a vessel, a conduit for something much darker than they could comprehend. Suddenly, the room went cold, so cold that their breath became visible, forming clouds in the air. Lena watched as the temperature dropped rapidly, as if the very essence of warmth was being sucked out of the room. Her teeth began to chatter, and she could feel her fingers stiffening as if the cold was reaching deep into her bones. A faint, cold wind brushed past them, its direction shifting like an invisible hand pushing them, guiding them to the far corner of the room. They followed the pull, each step a battle against the overwhelming weight pressing down on them. And then, they saw it. In the far corner, hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, was a small wooden chest, half buried under the bed's tattered curtains. No one had noticed it before. Lena, heart pounding, felt a sudden urge to approach it. She reached for it without thinking, her hand trembling as she touched the cold wood. The instant her fingers made contact, a shock of energy coursed through her, jolting her back. The room seemed to tighten around them, the walls closing in. The whispers grew louder, now forming words that they could understand. But the language was foreign, ancient, filled with dread. It was as if the room itself was speaking, begging for something, calling to them. Leave, or suffer, as they did. Lena gasped, her heart thumping wildly in her chest. The others recoiled in terror, but Lena couldn't pull her hand away from the chest. Something deep inside her urged her to open it, to discover the source of the room's torment. "Lena, stop!" James shouted, pulling her away. Inside was a tattered old journal, its pages yellowed with age and stained with what looked like dried blood. The air in the room grew thick, oppressive, as though the very act of opening the chest had triggered something ancient and vengeful. The pages fluttered as if caught in an invisible wind, and the whispers, now deafening, filled their ears, drowning out all other sound. Lena shakily opened the journal to the first page. As she read the faded handwriting, a dark realization settled over her. The journal had been written by a man who had stayed in this room long ago. His entry detailed his descent into madness, his growing obsession with the room, and the sinister force that had slowly consumed him. The entries grew more frantic with each passing day, until the final words were barely legible. "It's alive. The room itself is alive, and it will never let me leave." Lena slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The room seemed to grow darker, colder, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, angry, tormented, accusing. The group stood frozen in terror, the weight of the room's influence pressing down on them. They had unlocked something they should never have touched. In that moment, they realized the truth. The room was not just a place of evil, it was a living entity, feeding off fear, drawing power from the suffering of those who entered, and it would never let them leave, not until it had consumed them all. The friends were trapped in a nightmare far worse than they could have imagined. The room had marked them, and now, it would make them suffer. The room felt different now. It was no longer just a place of eerie silence and dark whispers. It had become an unholy entity, a living thing that pulsed with a malevolent energy, hungry for the souls of those who dared enter its domain. Lena, still clutching the ancient journal, could feel the weight of its dark history pressing down on her, its words gnawing at her mind. threatening to drive her to madness just as they had with the journal's original author. The others stood frozen in terror around her, their faces pale with fear. The cold had deepened, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in on them, making every breath feel like it might be their last. The walls of room 312 were alive with whispers, now not just in their ears but in their minds, digging into their thoughts, pulling up their darkest fears and regrets. "Why won't it stop?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What does it want from us?" Lena opened the journal again, her fingers stiff with dread as she turned the pages. The words blurred in front of her eyes, but one passage stood out, its meaning clearer than the others. It was written in frantic handwriting, the ink smeared as if the writer had been in a hurry, or perhaps in the throes of madness. "They never left. They live in the walls now. They are trapped here, just as I am. The room feeds off us. It always will." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The room, the journal, it was all starting to make sense now. The entity that haunted this place didn't just trap souls in the room. It fed off their fear, growing stronger with each passing night, twisting and distorting reality until it had complete control over its victims. The room was not merely a prison, it was a predator. A sharp, guttural scream broke the silence. James was on the floor, clutching his head, his face contorted in pain. "Get it out. Make it stop," he screamed, his voice rising to a fever pitch. The others rushed to him, but it was clear that something had taken hold of him. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and his body trembled uncontrollably. The air around them crackled with an unseen force, the room almost vibrating with dark energy. "James, fight it," Alex shouted, but his voice was lost in the thick fog of terror that had consumed them all. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like an angry storm. They could hear voices from the past, ghostly murmurs, tormented cries, and angry shouts like an endless chorus of suffering. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in on them, suffocating them with their oppressive weight. The floor beneath their feet creaked, as though it too was alive, shifting and groaning under their weight. Lena felt a sudden, sharp pull on her mind, like a force trying to drag her into the very heart of the darkness that surrounded them. She fought it, her hands trembling as she clutched the journal tighter. The words inside seemed to burn into her soul, pushing her towards something she wasn't ready to confront. Then, she saw it. In the corner of the room, the shadows shifted. They began to take form, coalescing into a dark figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, his face twisted in a grotesque expression of pain and rage. The figure stepped forward, its presence like a cold gust of wind, its every movement sending ripples of terror through the air. It was a figure from the past, someone who had once stayed in room 312, someone who had been consumed by the hotel's malevolent force. The man was looking directly at Lena, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. She could feel his pain, his rage, and most of all, his hunger. He wasn't just a ghost, he was a part of the room, a manifestation of its twisted power. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. You are the next one. The room has chosen you," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow, like 1,000 voices layered over one another. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back. The room seemed to shift around her, warping and distorting, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of the malevolent force that surrounded them. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be happening. We can leave. We can all leave." But the room laughed, low and guttural, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. It was not the voice of the man. It was something deeper, something older, far more sinister. "You cannot leave," the voice echoed, "because you are already here. You are part of the room now. You will never escape." Lena felt the weight of those words settle deep into her chest. The realization was crushing. They had been tricked. The room had never wanted them to leave. It had simply been toying with them, drawing them in with its false promises of escape. The room had chosen them, just as it had chosen countless others before them. They were part of its twisted collection now, their souls bound to it forever. In that moment, Lena understood the true horror of room 312. It wasn't just a haunted room, it was a living, breathing entity, feeding off the fear and pain of those who entered, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment and madness. The others were no longer themselves, they were shells, their minds broken by the room's influence. James, his eyes now clouded with terror, stood up shakily, his body moving like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. He was no longer fighting, he had given in, the room had claimed him. Lena's heart raced as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thickening, making it harder to breathe. The shadows were closing in around her, their dark tendrils reaching for her, pulling her into the abyss. But then, a flicker of defiance stirred within her. She couldn't let the room win. She couldn't let it claim her. Too, she had to fight, even if it meant confronting the darkness within. With a final, desperate cry, Lena threw the journal into the air, watching as it fluttered open, its pages spinning wildly. The dark figure recoiled as the journal was consumed by an unnatural force, and for the briefest moment, the room itself seemed to falter. The whispers fell silent. In that instant, Lena saw the truth. The room wasn't just a prison. It was a reflection of the souls trapped within it. The key to their escape wasn't in running. It was in confronting their deepest fears, their darkest regrets, and breaking the cycle that had ensnared them. With that understanding, she took a step forward. The room trembled, the air crackled with power, and then, everything went dark. Lena's chest heaved as she stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by shadows that stretched out like twisted fingers, reaching for her. The room felt colder now, its air thick with the remnants of a presence that refused to leave. She could still hear the muffled screams of her friends echoing in her mind, the sound of James's voice, a broken, hollow echo of the man he had been. The figure, that horrible specter from the past, had faded into the shadows, but its malevolent influence lingered. Something had shifted. She thought the room had been defeated when she threw the journal into the air, but now, as the flickering lights dimmed once more, she realized something far darker was unfolding. The whispers had stopped, but there was a new sound, one that chilled her to the bone, a faint thudding, like the slow, deliberate beat of a heart. Lena's eyes darted around the room, her breath catching in her throat as the realization hit her. The room itself was alive. But no longer just an entity, it was feeding. The horror wasn't over, it was evolving. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet groaned and shifted, as if the very foundation of the hotel was stirring. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled back, her body slick with cold sweat. The air felt thick, pressing against her skin, squeezing the breath from her lungs. There was something wrong, something off about everything now. The walls were moving. They shifted slowly, like a living thing, the old wallpaper folding back to reveal dark stains, dried blood, and what looked like scratches, deep gouges that marred the wood beneath. But it wasn't the walls alone that had changed. The room itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in unnatural rhythms. The temperature plummeted once more, frost creeping across the windows, as the shadowy tendrils from the corners seemed to close in on her. Lena was trapped. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, as if the room had swallowed it. Her legs refused to move. She was paralyzed, caught between fear and a terrifying realization that hit her like a slap across the face. She was not the only one left in the room. The others, her friends, were still here, in some form, but they were no longer the people she had known. They were ghosts, echoes of the torment the room had inflicted on them, the last remnants of their humanity swallowed by the malevolent force that had claimed this space. But worse still, they weren't just trapped in this room, they were part of it now. They were the room's influence. Lena's breath hitched as she looked toward the corner where James had been moments ago. He was there, his face distorted, hollowed out, his skin drawn tight across his skull, eyes wide and glazed over. But it wasn't just James, there were more of them. Alex, Sarah, and even the figure who had once been Lena's best friend, Chloe. They stood motionless, their eyes locked onto Lena, their expressions unreadable. Then the voice came, a low, rumbling growl, deep and guttural, emanating from somewhere close but impossible to pinpoint. "You thought you could escape," it hissed, "but you never left. None of you did." Lena's pulse raced as she backed away, her mind spinning. The twisted realization clawed at her. She wasn't alone in this room. She never had been. The hotel had drawn them all here, bound them together, and it had twisted the very fabric of their reality. The room had been feeding on them the whole time. And now, it was clear, the room was not haunted by ghosts. It was a collection of those who had entered before them, those who had been consumed by it, just as they had been. The twisted specters of her friends began to move, not in the way of the living, but like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. They moved in unison, their bodies jerking and twitching unnaturally as they advanced toward Lena. Their eyes, once filled with fear, now glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, as if their souls had been overtaken. The room had transformed them, merged their existence with the darkness that thrived here. Lena tried to speak, to call out to them, but no words came. It was as though the room had silenced her, cutting her off from any hope of communication, as if it were trying to erase everything that made her human. The whispers grew louder again, swirling in her head, and then she heard the voice, soft and close, in the pit of her mind. You thought you could break the cycle, but you were always meant to be a part of it. The room doesn't let go. It consumes. It feeds. Lena fell to her knees, the weight of the truth crushing her. The others, her friends, had been lost the moment they entered this place. And now, she was no different. She was just another soul, claimed by the insatiable hunger of room 312. Desperation rose in her chest as she tried to gather the last of her strength. She had to do something, but what? What was left to do? Was there any way to escape the clutches of this hellish place? The floorboards creaked beneath her, and she looked up to see the shadows in the room converge into something alive. The dark figure, the one from before, was back, but this time, it was not alone. Lena felt the presence of countless others, shadows of people who had stayed here, people who had tried to escape, who had failed. Their faces were twisted, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. They surrounded her, closing in, their eyes empty but full of hunger. But then, amidst the confusion and darkness, she saw it, the journal, the one thing that had seemed to have power over the room, the one thing that could hold its influence at bay. But now, the journal lay at the center of the room, glowing with a faint, ominous light. It was no longer just a relic of the past, it was the key. The room had been using the journal all along. The twisted cycle of torment would continue unless Lena made a choice. The question was simple: did she want to become part of it, or would she end the cycle for good? The air around her thickened, her body trembling with fear. The spirits of her friends, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of despair, closed in, and Lena knew there was no escaping their grasp. The room had claimed them all, and now, it would claim her. Lena's hand reached toward the journal, her fingers brushing its cover. As soon as she touched it, the room seemed to shake violently, as if the very foundation of the hotel was being ripped apart. But the journal was different now. It wasn't just an object, it was the heart of the room's darkness. The whispers surged in her ears, drowning out all other sound. The room screamed for her to stop, but Lena didn't listen. She had to end it. With a final, shuddering breath, she opened the journal one last time, releasing the room's grip on her. And then, darkness consumed her. The darkness in room 312 had now taken on a life of its own. The very air seemed to suffocate Lena, wrapping around her chest, pressing on her ribcage as if the room itself was feeding off her fear. The faint whispers that had once sounded like voices from another world were now becoming distinct. They were her friends, twisted, lost souls now entwined with the hotel's dark power. Lena could feel their eyes, though she couldn't see them. They burned through her, searching, probing for something. Was it hope? Was it fear? Did they even know what they had become anymore? Or were they merely shadows of the torment that had once consumed them, now spread across the very fabric of the room? She had touched the journal, the key. The truth she had unlocked was a curse that would never release its grip on her. The room was not just haunted by the souls of the past. It had become a living nightmare, its hunger eternal. Her friends, her memories, the life she had known, all of it had been swallowed whole. The journal had opened the doors to the past, but in doing so, it had sealed their fate. Lena now understood what the room wanted, what it had always wanted. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about haunting. It was about knowledge. The room craved the stories of those who had stayed there, the pain and the suffering, the stories of people who had been consumed by its power. And now, Lena had become a part of that knowledge. She had learned too much, far too much for a mortal to bear. She had uncovered the room's history, and in doing so, had made herself its latest offering. The last of the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into total darkness. The oppressive weight of the air grew heavier, thick with the stench of decay and forgotten lives. For a fleeting moment, Lena thought she had slipped into unconsciousness, that she was finally free. But when the darkness began to dissipate, she realized that what had come next wasn't freedom, it was a prison. The room, she now saw, had shifted, not in the way that a house settles overnight, but in the way that a thing alive moves, breathing, pulsating with dark intent. The walls had drawn in, enclosing her like a vice. The floor was no longer solid beneath her feet, but soft like sand, shifting and giving way under her weight. The ceiling seemed to sink, low enough to press against her head. And then she saw them, the figures. They were no longer her friends. No, they had transcended into something far worse. Their bodies were distorted, with sharp angles and broken limbs, twisted and bent beyond recognition. They were the manifestations of the knowledge she had so desperately sought, the tortured souls of the past, now bound to the room, their forms melting into the very walls, their eyes, still filled with the same vacant terror they had shown when they had first entered, locked onto her, unblinking. The figures began to move toward her, their steps slow and deliberate, but this time, they were not beckoning her in the way they had before. No, they were warning her. The price of knowledge had been paid. The shadows seemed to deepen around Lena, stretching like fingers, as if the room itself was trying to grasp her. The journal she had once held so desperately was now gone. She didn't need it anymore. The knowledge, the stories, the torments of countless souls, all of it had become a part of her, a part of her soul. "You shouldn't have come," the whisper came again, but this time it was not a distant voice. It was hers. It was the voice of all the souls that had ever stayed in this room, the collective agony of everyone who had perished here, now merged into a single, unified scream that was simultaneously inside her and all around her. Lena's body trembled, her knees buckling as the weight of it all crushed her spirit. The room pulsed with energy, feeding off her fear, but it wasn't the fear of death that tormented her. No, it was the horror of knowing that she was now part of the cycle. She had become one with the room, and there was no escape. Her existence was tied to this place forever. Her fingers reached toward the dark, her mind screaming for mercy, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing left to save her. The last flicker of hope she had clung to, the hope that the room could be defeated, that the cycle of torment could be broken, vanished as she felt her soul meld with the walls. The journal had been the key to unlocking the room's dark influence, but Lena was the key to its continuation. In her, the room had found its perfect vessel. The figures around her began to chant, their voices melding into one, a cacophony of agonized cries that echoed in the recesses of her mind. She could feel their pain, their anger, their desperation. She was no longer herself, she was now the room's. And as she sank into the shadows, her mind lost in the dark eternity that awaited her, the whispers continued to swirl in the room, growing louder, angrier. They weren't just the voices of her friends anymore. No, these were the voices of everyone who had entered this cursed place, seeking refuge, seeking rest. They were all part of it now. The room had claimed them. It had claimed her. In the silence that followed, room 312 settled once more, its hunger momentarily sated, but its cycle never ending. And the next souls would soon arrive.